Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the Nordic model, which is a sort of economic system that's in the Scandinavian countries. Let's start. So typically with this model, there's like a sort of split between the economy and the social elements of it. So it's very much like a free market capitalism on the one side and extensive social programs on the other. And in the free market, you typically have strong or very strong property rights. You have an impartial judicial system to resolve disputes. You typically have low or average taxes, and where the social programs are funded, I'll explain later. You typically have low regulations on businesses. Typically, there's like a high degree of trust between the people and the companies in the free market. It is easy to start companies in terms of regulations or licenses that are needed. There are very low requirements. And you have less of these laws where you need to prove, where you're pronounced guilty and you need to prove that you're innocent, or in a sense, you need to prove that you're not harming anyone before you're allowed to take any steps in your business or something along those lines. There's a lot of what's called creative destruction, or the creative destruction is an element of the market. For those who don't know what that means, it means that there's a high degree of innovation, there's a higher degree of disruption as well, and there's also very few or fewer labor rights. That means it's easy for them to hire people, it's also easier for them to fire people. But typically on the social side, the workers will have a sort of social safety net. And at least two of the countries in Scandinavia, there's very large countrywide unions. That sort of makes it more expensive to hire people. But in these specific unions, there's no government intervention. Like, the governments don't pass laws towards the unions or against the unions. The interaction between the unions is directly with the private sector. Now, social programs in the Nordic model, they're funded typically by taxpayers, usually by a high income tax. Typical workers can get to keep 40% of their salary after taxes. And in one country, specifically Norway, has a social wealth fund, but it does not affect the high level of tax. They're still high. Usually there are high quality programs within those social spending, specifically education, healthcare, pensions, and there's usually less of a concern if those are provided by the private or the public sector. So, for example, Sweden has a school voucher system for their education with a mix of public and private. Pensions usually in these countries are private, with the exception perhaps of state employees specifically. But because there's like a degree of trust between the private sector and the people, then there isn't such an issue around this. Government usually administers these social programs, and again, there's a degree of trust between the people and the government doing this efficiently. Typically in these countries with these programs, there is low income inequality as a result, and there's also high gender equality. Some of the preconditions for these Nordic models would be They usually are in homogeneous societies, meaning societies that have the same values, the same culture, and typically within that society people from the same ancestry. And there's very much like a sense of community, that everyone is in it together. Also, something I've noticed that these countries have a sort of industrial element to their economy. Typically, it's to do with manufacturing. There's a lot of manufacturing companies, for example, in Sweden, which means that workers, when they're hired by those companies, the companies invest in those workers, so they're able to use the advanced or sophisticated machinery, and that investment in those workers carries on throughout their career. And typically, with this manufacturing sector, there's a lot of exports from this to other country, or at least that's an element, seems to be an important element within those Nordic countries. There is also low corruption, as I've already mentioned. There's a high degree of trust, and as a result, or perhaps because there's low corruption, the result is that there is a high degree of trust. Some issues with the Nordic model. So if you have an aging population, it is harder for the system to keep up with it. Sweden, in particular, in the last couple of years, has scaled back their pension, or how much the older people are allowed to receive from the government, and how frequently they get certain benefits. I believe that they have been scaling it back recently, but they've also scaled it back in the 90s, I believe, as well. So aging population is always a big issue. Migrants is also an issue. Typically, when you sort of plan an economy and you want to have social programs, then it's an either-or situation with regards to social programs and migrants. You either have high social programs and low migrants, or high migrants and low social programs. It's difficult to have both. So some migrants can come to those countries to take advantage of those social programs. Typically, there is low labor participation of migrants in the economy. This may not necessarily be the fault of migrants. It is often, well, I don't know if it's often, but I have heard stories where foreigners applying for jobs in those countries are told that, because they're not from the culture, or they don't speak the language as well, it would be easier for those companies to communicate with someone who is local, or either the same language, is very fluent in the same language, or from the same culture. It improves communication, and that's something they can just say to dismiss applicants. And it seems that migrants find it difficult to integrate with the rest of society. There are obviously pockets in the population where migrants choose to live next to each other, and open their own stores and their own food shops and stuff like that. But it may be the case that migrants find it more difficult to integrate to these cultures. Not always, but sometimes. The particular Nordic model is a non-Marxian model. There is no interest in the workers controlling the means of production. As I mentioned earlier, there's a high degree of trust with the private sector. They typically tend to be more liberal or liberal utilitarian, whereas Marxist variants would be anti-liberal. I would, because I'm in the UK, I would see it more as Fabian socialism, but then again, I'm here. And typically poor countries that have ruined their economy through Marxist economic decisions would choose to use the Nordic model to repair that economic damage. Some people it may seem like neoliberal practices, but that's sometimes the case that would happen. It is also very expensive to live in these countries. Food is expensive, rent is expensive, fuel is expensive, even in the case of Norway. Going out is expensive. And it's not necessarily the case that salaries are considerably higher either. They are higher, but they're not incredibly higher. And the salaries themselves are, again, highly taxed. And the jobs are somewhat union controlled in a sense that on the low end of jobs, the salary for those jobs would be higher than in other countries compared to other countries. But at the same side of the coin, higher end jobs like engineering would be paid lower. They're capped in a certain sense. Whereas if they were to go to other countries, they would be able to get a higher salary because of this sort of union control. So if you were to have like a sort of higher end job, it may not pay as much and it will be taxed high and everything else is expensive as well. In these countries, there is extreme wealth inequality, a difference from extreme income inequality. The wealth inequality is quite high. It's very close to 1. And part of the reason is because it's difficult to have savings when you're taxed as much as you are. These countries kind of encourage you to get into debt. So a lot of people in the countries have like negative wealth. And the debt that you're encouraged to take can be up to 110% of your income, I think. And on top of that, there are things that can deduct from your taxes. So, for example, if you buy a home, the mortgage payments for that would be deducted from your taxes. So, in a sense, because you're allowed to borrow as much as you are, and because the bigger house you buy, like that the monthly mortgage fees offset the taxes, you're kind of encouraged to buy larger and larger homes. Which kind of like reflects in a way to measures of social mobility. You have this really, really big house, you make all these payments, but it's because of the way that debt is encouraged in society. Typically, the richest people in those in the Nordic countries are from this larger family wealth. Families that have had wealth for sort of hundreds of years in a sense. And the people there will be people managing those families' wealth, but they won't like do it like in a very risky sort of ventures. They'll do like a slow rate of growth for this wealth over many years. And in addition, like the richer families won't show off their wealth as much as other countries in the West may do. The culture there is more I would say timid on this, but it's not typical for them to show off their wealth as much. Another issue with the Nordic model is it typically has a very high youth unemployment. I've seen cases between 22 and 30% youth unemployment, but in some cases it has been higher. It's not fully understood why, but a large reason could be high wages, or like the entry jobs themselves are relatively high wages, and companies that expect people to be in those wages should also have high skills, but as someone who is just joining the market may not have that. So in a sense, this is an element of unions increasing the salary of these jobs, which makes it harder for young people to enter them. And that's it. Thank you for watching my tutorial on the Nordic model. I hope it's been helpful, and see you in the next video.